Following Mercury's maturation, we go on to the maturation of Saturn at 36. And this is a serious maturation. And Saturn maturation is when you basically grow up. Okay? A lot of people think you grow up at the Saturn return. It's like, no. I explained the Saturn return in the transits video. It's in Saturn's maturation that you sort of mature as a person. And it tends to quite often be a very difficult time. The simple reason being that Saturn has so many enemies. Sun, Moon, and Mars are his enemies. His one friend is Venus. So most people's chart, Saturn is sort of beat up. And that's the real reason Saturn causes troubles, because all of his enemies are being so mean to him. No one treats Saturn well except Venus. Everyone else just kicks Saturn around, and so Saturn hurts when he comes along. And so when Saturn matures, chances are he's going to have some big afflictions to him. So of all the maturations, the Saturn maturation most regularly is the most difficult, and that's at 36. It's such an important maturation. In fact, in palmistry, you've got your two lines crossing on top, the heart line and the head line. Then you got your fate line running up the middle of your hand. And most people do timing off the fate line. And where the fate line intersects the head line, that's 36. Okay? Now some palmists say it's like 30 or 32, but the most accurate ones I've seen and what I found works really well is making that 36, having that coincide with your Saturn maturation. Okay? So it's a really important year, this 36-year time. So what does Saturn maturing mean? Well, Saturn is your burdens. Saturn is your pain. Saturn is your suffering. How are you going to bear those? Like we say, Saturn is the cross that we carry. We all have these burdens in our lives, these tragedies in our lives, these pains in our lives. And we have to bear those. Once they happen, there's no rewind, there's no Control-Z on your computer of life to go back before that happened and to do it right. You have burdens, you have regrets, you have severe mistakes, and somehow all that's, you have guilt, you have shame, you name it, you have all that pain that we heap on ourselves. And somehow we have to live with it. Okay? And that's basically what being mature is being able to bear your burdens and still do the great things in life that you're expected to do, that you have the abilities to do. And that's what happens when the Saturn maturation comes along. Oftentimes a person gets pummeled and gets a burden placed upon them. A burden of pain, guilt, shame, regret, you name it. Something that just drags them down. And sometimes makes them not even want to live. And they have to bear that anyway. They have to keep going anyway. So you can imagine in the case of a really bad Saturn, how this could be a period where oftentimes people want to die. It's also interesting in Gemini, we break longevity into short, medium, or long. Short is from 0 to 36. Medium is 36 to 72. And 72 and onwards is long. So again, 36, we see it as this divisionary line between short and medium life. So can you cross the Saturn maturation? And that's the time when events can happen that are so painful the person doesn't even wish they didn't even were alive for it. But being alive, what are they going to do? How are they going to handle it? Are they going to run away and hide? Are they going to shoot themselves? Or are they just going to cry and deal with it? And in the times of intense Saturn maturations that are really painful, people can carry those burdens all the way to Rahu maturation. And hopefully they'll have a good Rahu maturation. If not, they won't ever deal with those Saturn burdens effectively until maybe at 48. If they have a good K2 maturation, they'll get through it at 48. So 36 is a critical time in our lives. Are we going to be able to deal with our burdens in life? Are we mentally prepared? Do we have the intelligence, the wisdom, the knowledge to look at things and deal with things in a way that we can continue onward in our life in a healthy, productive way while we carry that pain, while we carry that burden. That's what the Saturn maturation is about. Sounds scary, right? Well, it's like so regularly. I just see that age, 35 to 36, really smash someone with some stuff that they're going to regret the rest of their lives. They're just going to play the game in a way that they wish they hadn't, or events will happen to them that they wish never happened, that were never part of their reality. And now what are they going to do? Well, one of the parts of Saturn maturation is just realizing that we all have our karma and we have to bear it. And sometimes that karma means being upset with ourselves, angry with ourselves, hating ourselves, whatever, because of something we did. But that everyone has those. And Saturn needs to understand that everyone has those burdens that are put upon us by fate, and that those burdens are not judgments by God. They're not God saying you're evil there because you did this. It's more like it's a burden of your sufferings that you have to burn as a karmic burden this lifetime to feel so bad about something you did. But what God wants you to do is to shoulder that cross, stand up straight and be proud and be strong in who you are, and go forward in your life. Go forward with the people in your life. Go forward with what you need to do in your life and be successful, and continue the journey towards Rahu and Ketu. And basically, we all have a psychology. We all have a psychology that creates lacks and needs. And when the Saturn maturation comes, a lot of the events that can come into place can be the ones that frustrate our needs and our psychology and our complexes, and give us so much cause for just pain and frustration. The mature way to deal with it is to bear that cross, okay, with as much understanding as we can. But Saturn's one of those planets that he's not an understanding planet. He's not intelligent. He's ignorant, right? He's lazy. He's not the planet of making things change. He's the planet of just hanging on until time makes things better. In fact, it's like that Pat Benatar song, the deepest wounds are healed by fate. And that's kind of stuff that happens with Saturn. Sometimes in this maturation, we'll get wounded really bad. And Saturn's not the planet that's going to deal with those wounds in a creative, philosophical way. He just bears them. He just suffers them. Until one day fate or time will take off that pain, remove that pain. And one day they'll wake up and something will happen in their lives, and this huge burden of Saturn becomes lighter, or becomes something they just shoulder and toss off their shoulders. It can be really intense. Now, let's say you got an amazing Saturn, okay, just that's a really strong Saturn, that's not getting afflicted, and you have that rare, really, truly healthy detachment about life. That's true detachment of just understanding that life has a simple quality of tragedy that's just part of it, and to not get caught up in all the dramas of life and what you could have done and what you should have done. Let's say you've got one of those really amazing Saturns that gives you that true simplicity of the type of person who can truly be happy in a world full of tragedy and pain. So let's say you got one of those Saturns. Raise your hand. I don't expect anyone to be raising it, okay? But if you do or see someone with one of those Saturns, which you probably never will because they won't come into your office, but if you somehow do see one of those people, when their Saturn maturation comes along, sure, they're going to have some intense events. They're going to push all their buttons of pain, guilt, remorse, you name it, of neglect, of feeling unloved, of feeling unappreciated, whatever your complex is, whatever your need is that you're not getting. But they'll somehow just naturally shoulder that. They'll just see this is simply the way of life. This is just the way of the world. Why get beat up by it? You know, it's not something to look at in a negative way. It's just the way things are. Nature's hard. Look around you. Whereas a person with a lesser Saturn will measure themselves in the context of those events and find reason for guilt and shame and self-condemnation and blame and self-hate. And then that's the true cross of Saturn that they'll carry around to their own doom. And usually there's always something like that, some deep crosses that people hold on to. But a great Saturn just throws off the cross and goes, hey, shit happens, fate happens, life happens. I'm here to live. I'm not here to live drudgerously. I'm not here to feel guilty. I'm not here to feel bad about the hardships that are just part of life. That's what a truly good Saturn will give. It will give that. Just that simplicity of understanding that life is hard. Why are you any different? Why should your life be easier? Just because your life is hard, that doesn't mean you're any less or any better than anyone else. Life is just that way. But most of us have some afflictions to our Saturn, so we're always struggling against the simple truth that life is hard and we all suffer. So when we do something wrong, or we cause suffering, or somebody makes us suffer, whatever the case may be, we take it personally. And taking it personally, we start the whole process of attaching ourselves to a psychological complex that's going to cause us a lot of pain and grief, perhaps for years, until we can mature out of it when Rahu comes. So basically, when the Saturn maturation happens, that's the final conscious maturation of the conscious planets. After that, we go into the Rahu-Ketu maturations. All these are so important. Rahu gives results of Saturn, we say in astrology. So the Rahu process of moving towards the Rahu maturation is more closely linked to the Saturn maturation than most other maturations are linked to each other. So if you have a tough time in your Saturn maturation, you're probably going to carry this huge, heavy cross with glass on it, digging into your shoulders, until you have a good Rahu maturation. Okay? A good Rahu maturation can turn around the Saturn. Okay? So, they kind of almost work together. The pain that we bear, through the Saturn maturation, the things that weigh us down, in a way make a person more ready to embrace the Rahu, to embrace the new. Because after a while, you get so sick of your cross. You get so sick of your burdens that you want something new and fresh, something completely different. You want a change of your reality, which is Rahu. So the Saturn maturation prepares you for the openness, the true change of your reality that can come during the Rahu maturation. Okay? And then the Rahu maturation prepares you for the Ketu maturation. And see, the foundation of Saturn in our chart is Ketu, believe it or not. Okay? Saturn is born out of Ketu. We see that in medical astrology, where Ketu, which is bacteria, breeds disease, which is Saturn. So we have this little cycle going on. Rahu gives results to Saturn. Rahu leads to Ketu. Ketu is the foundation planet to Saturn. Okay? And this is all in the latter portion of our lives, or in the middle half of our lives. So if you have a difficult Saturn maturation, you're going to struggle until your Rahu maturation, but those struggles are not wasted. If you have a bad Saturn maturation and you're really suffering and hating life and down on yourself, well, you're supposed to be, because Rahu, it'll make you more open to the possibilities of Rahu. And ultimately, we have to embrace Rahu completely before we can perfect Ketu. When Ketu gets perfected, Saturn gets resolved, because Ketu is the foundation of Saturn. So once we perfect Ketu, or at the highest level, once we become realized, which is Ketu, Saturn fate ceases to matter. Burdens and crosses no longer exist. Okay? So, Saturn maturation gives us the pain and readiness and preparation for us to embrace the new things of Rahu, which we normally wouldn't embrace if we weren't, part of us didn't want to escape the misery of our lives. Because we don't want to embrace Rahu. Whatever house Rahu's in is a house you really don't want to go to. You say you want it, and you act like you want it, and you get pulled into it. But there's a big part of you that hangs back in the Ketu house. And hanging back at the Ketu house, you always end up doing a bad job in the Rahu house. Okay? So, when you finally embrace the Rahu house fully at the maturation age of Rahu at 42, you do that Because Saturn's been making you so miserable, you're really ready for something new and different. Because you just hate in your life so much, okay? Then when you embrace Rahu, you finally develop the missing things you need to perfect Ketu. And Ketu gets perfected, Saturn's fate is born. So this age from 36 to 48 is 12 years of age. These are really the years of most profound psychological and spiritual growth in people, of the biggest changes, particularly the ages from 42 to 48, when we get into the whole Rahu thing, the Rahu-Ketu maturations. But Saturn sort of sets us up for that. It either gives us the burden of pain that we heap upon ourselves, that makes us get so sick of our lives, what we're used to and comfortable with, which is Ketu, that we're ready to embrace Rahu when we finally get it at the Rahu maturation. Or it makes us feel we finally become so strong and detached from things if we have a really good Saturn, and just see the simplicity and naturalness of the hardships of life, that we don't have any fears that would keep us from embracing Rahu when it matures at 42. But in either case, Saturn maturation prepares us to embrace the Rahu maturation. And again, by embrace I mean fully. To fully let go of every inhibition that's holding us back from mastering Rahu. And then when we master the Rahu, we're ready to master the Ketu last. So we'll talk about the Rahu maturation more in the next video. But just understand these three maturations are so very, very important. Okay? Alright, I'll give some examples of Saturn maturations in the next video. So for Saturn's maturation, the important vargas to look at are the Dasamsha, which has to do with great deeds. If a person is doing a lot of important things and have a lot of responsibilities that they consider worthwhile, then that helps a person get through their Saturn maturation solidly, because it makes it feel like, okay, life is hard, but I have something worthwhile to do. There's a reason for me to be here, that kind of idea. And again, Saturn maturation comes when you really have to deal with the hardest parts of your life, and you have to deal with the parts of yourself that you have the most problems with. So you know, the events that come will generally cause you to confront yourself with your deepest issues that you have about yourself. And that often results in a lot of self-condemnation and self-hate, and that can be really painful. With a good Saturn, a person's not going to have those issues, and so the Saturn maturation is going to be much smoother. But we always confront our weaknesses. You know, we confront our lower selves, our dark side, during that Saturn maturation. And it's a really important time of psychological maturation. So the first horoscope we're going to look at, looking at Saturn aspects-wise, well, Saturn's aspected by enemy Mars, conjunct friend Venus, and aspected by neutral Jupiter to 10 points. So he mostly has good influences. This would appear at first glance to be a good Saturn maturation, because Saturn's conjunct Venus. However, if we look more closely in the Rashi, Saturn is sleeping in Leo, and Ritu dead, and it's the Atmakaraka, bombed by this being in the sun sign, starved to minus 145 points. Okay? In the Dasamsha, Saturn is once again sleeping in Aries, debilitated and stressed. It's helped by Venus, but then starved badly by his enemy Lord Mars to 100 negative points. So that's a problematical Saturn. In the D60, Saturn is once again starved in Leo, smashed by the Sun to minus 145 points, hurt by Mars, helped by Venus. So it's tough pretty much everywhere other than the Trimsamsha. In the Trimsamsha, Saturn is debilitated, but his enemy Mars is sleeping too, so he can't directly take him out. Then he gets a little help from Mercury, his friend. But he's still debilitated. Never an ideal thing to have a debilitated planet. So this person was an Oscar, his name is Malik Benjolo, who won an Oscar for directing a movie, I believe, called The Sugar Man. And he committed suicide shortly after his 36th birthday, and due to depression. So he couldn't deal with the negative parts of himself with his Saturn. and he opted out. And Saturn was his Atmakarika as well. So you can see the self-infliction. Atmakarika is the self planet to this person. So when you get a really negative Saturn, you can get a person who just can't deal with the negative parts of themselves. They get confronted with who they really are, with their weaknesses, with their failings, or they do something that shows them, that they're not the amazing person they thought they were. And if there's not a planet there helping them to hold it together, at that point a person will oftentimes no longer want to live. And you'll find that suicide rates are higher at the age of 36 than one of the higher ages. There's other ages that are high for suicide due to different reasons, but one of them is 36, okay, as it was in this case. Okay, the next chart we want to look at is Princess Diana's chart. She, of course, died shortly after her 36th birthday. So, like, what is it, 2 months or so later, we had that big eclipse that September that took both Diana and Mother Teresa. Eclipses can bring good people in or take them out. And that was, if I remember right, was the reddish eclipse, which usually brings more trouble, more deaths and things like that. So anyway, the eclipse was definitely an indicative of a famous, important personality's death. But let's see how that works out with her Saturn maturation. It's not going to work out the way you expected it. Okay, Saturn is solid in the Rashi at 129 points. Okay, aspect-wise, in general, Saturn's hurt by the Sun, his enemy, but helped by Mercury and Venus a bit more than he's hurt. And he's hurt a little bit by Mars, but it comes out a bit better than average. So he's a decent Saturn, not a good one, but mediocre, a bit better than average mediocre. Okay. However, point-wise, it comes out really good. He's solid to 129 points. He's boosted by Venus for an extra 60 points, and he's only hurt by the Sun to 29. He's good in the Rashi. In the Dasamsha, Saturn is great at 129. Boosted by Mercury to 44, hurt by the Sun but never taken to a negative. In the Trim Samsha, Saturn is never taken to a negative. He starts out with 129, gets boosted by 240 points by Venus, and the little hurt of the Sun and Moon won't matter against that great Venus. In the Shashtyamsha, Saturn is sleeping in Leo, hurt by Mars a bit, but then boosted by Venus and Mercury. Saturn's good. Well, right after her 35th birthday, her divorce was finalized. So she got this divorce, which she had wanted, and things were working really good for her. She maintained her lifestyle. She didn't lose any fame. The people loved her just as much. She wasn't disgraced from the divorce. She held herself well. She firmly moved forward with the rest of her life, and that's because she had a great Saturn maturation. She was at what could have been a very dire, depressing time in her life, getting divorced, possibly, having fears of public disgrace, Christians throwing books at her for divorcing, all this stuff that could have happened, but none of that happened. She just went right through it. If anything, everyone loved her more. She had a great Saturn maturation. She went on and lived her life as fully as possible. And it was shortly after 37 that she actually died. But she wasn't, it wasn't suicide. She was solid in her life. She was solid in the public eye. She was more loved than ever. She went through a great Saturn maturation. Unfortunately, Saturn maturation is not the only thing that can kill a person. Okay, she was running dashas that were not good for death. An eclipse was there to take away some important personalities, of which it took 2 of them. Ironically, both of which were female, Mother Teresa and Princess Diana. So really a sad time, but it wasn't the Saturn maturation. So the example I'm using this for is to let you know that you can have a good Saturn maturation. That's not necessarily going to keep you alive. It could mean that you die in a really solid place with yourself. And Princess Diana was in a very solid place with herself. when she did die, all in all, as we can see that by this better than average Saturn. And of course, it's really good in the Dasumsha. Now, she actually died after 36, so the Saturn maturation had just completed, but you will see lots of times people kill themselves after they turn 36 to 37, because the pains that awaken within them from 35 to 36, they just can't live with it anymore, so they might die at 37 or kill themselves. But in her case, that wasn't so. She had a good Saturn, she was solid, she was in a good place in her life, but she just had the unfortunate fate to die due to her longevity expiring. But it wasn't a negative Saturn maturation. So again, with astrology, you get every possible mix. It is great to be able to, you won't commonly see a person die at 36 or 37 if they had a good maturation. That's not a common thing. If it does happen, it's always going to be the result of a tragedy, like a car accident or something like that. It won't be from cancer or sickness. If you have a solid Saturn in your Saturn maturation, I didn't talk about this much, but one of the things Saturn maturation will do in a solid Saturn, it can help a person do the things that promote their longevity. They may have something that maybe frightens them a little bit about their health and gets them focused on their health in a really positive way. But if a person has a good solid Saturn, they're not going to die of a disease in their Saturn maturation. Okay? But then again, that they might die because the fate, it's over for them, as it was in Diana's case, in which case it's going to be a tragic event. Okay? And the event wouldn't have been as tragic if she hadn't been so solid and loved and appreciated the year before that she got, that last year during her Saturn maturation. Okay? So you can still die when there's a bad Saturn maturation, or a good Saturn maturation. You can live when there's a tough one too. But to live healthily, you got to have without a lot of complexes and pain haunting you for years and years until you're Rahu, you need to have some good planets affecting you, affecting your Saturn. Okay, this is this chart that we also looked at for the Mercury maturation. This person had a really, really tough Mercury maturation. Let's see how their Saturn maturation goes. Saturn maturation, well, let's look at aspects first. Saturn is conjunct its friend Venus, hurt by Mars, and neutral by Jupiter. So it's a good Saturn, conjunct its friend Venus. Okay. In the Rashi, unfortunately, Saturn's sleeping, and in his enemy sign Leo, and his enemy sun's taking 200 points out of him. So Saturn's problematical in the Rashi chart. When Saturn's problematical in the Rashi chart, you usually feel stuck in your life. You usually feel like you've got burdens that you just sort of can't avoid. Your life is kind of full of more burdens than you want. That's just part of the picture. In the Dasumsha chart, Saturn here sitting at 50 points, gets boosted by Venus to 14 more points, gets hurt a little bit by the Mars to 9 points, but nothing really damaging it. Okay. In the Trim Samsha, Saturn's solid at 50 points, gets boosted by Venus to 29 points. Okay. Shashtiamsha, Saturn is thirsty or sleeping in Cancer, suffers from Mars's aspect, which makes it thirsty. Then it's boosted by Venus, a benefic, to 58, which is going to remove that thirst of Mars onto Saturn. Saturn, again, is just thirsted by Mars instead of starved because he's in a watery sign. So his friend Venus bails him out, makes him a decent Saturn in the Shashtiamsha too. So this person has a good Saturn. Okay, so when Saturn maturation came, a lot of things happened. They, during that year, they got married, okay, or they had a child, they got married, they made peace with their father, they made full peace with their father, back to their normal relationship. They didn't, like a good Saturn does, it doesn't hold a grudge, it doesn't get bitter, none of which this person did. They were forgiving to their father. They felt sorry that their father was, suffering so much difficulties and stress that he even chose to do that. But they really rose above all that mess that the Mercury maturation had caused. But the one problem they did have during the Saturn maturation is they kind of, felt like they were, just had a lot of, debts. They felt weighed down by their school debts from their school loan. Saturn represents debts, of course. Saturn rules the 6th house here, the house of debts. Okay, so they sort of struggled with that, and they felt like they were stuck working more than they wanted to. But at the same time, you can see this assumption is good. They felt like they were doing good work. They were proud of their work because there was a good Saturn here. They felt their work was important. It's just they felt overburdened by finances and work time, when they would have liked to have spent more time, with their family and so on. So their path was hard and really stressful with the Saturn here. But they themselves were very solid, thanks to Saturn being good in these other Vargas. And so their Saturn maturation was actually very productive. Mercury maturation didn't just ruin their relationship with their father and didn't help them move forward in anything in their life. Saturn maturation got them married, got them a kid, healed the wounds with their father, was a very productive, good maturation. Okay, so you might have noticed by now, as we've done a lot of these maturations, that the Rasi chart influences aren't as important as the Varga chart influences. How many times have we seen a good Saturn in the Rashi or a good planet in the Rashi have a difficult maturation because it's bad in the Vargas, and vice versa? So Vargas are really a key. The Rashi is just your path. How hard the road is not that important. It's what happens along the road and how you deal with the things along the road. That's what determines your success going up that road. And, when you've got like something like this with the Saturn really negative, well, that just means the road is really, really steep. But that doesn't mean you can't, march right up it, okay? If Saturn or the planet, the maturing planet, is solid in the other charts, okay? Now, when these maturations occur, you can get more creative and work harder and get more insights. And as you start looking at charts, you'll see things a lot. Like, for instance, in this person's chart, Saturn rules the 5th house, the house of children, right? So we can go over to the Saptamsha and say, oh, 5th house children type things might be important during your maturation. And you'll see Saturn sitting at 400 points, super strong, boosted by its friend Venus, and only hurt a little bit by Mars. It's a great Saturn. It rules Jupiter, which represents children, and they have a child and they're really happy with it. They love having a child. They've got this great Saturn in the Saptamsha, all the work, all the stress, all the extra financial burden is totally worth it to this person because they have this great Saturn in the Saptamsha. So as you work with maturations, look, find the most important Vargas. If it rules a house, go to the house of that Varga. If it's a Jaimini Karaka for something, go to the Varga that represents that Karaka. And then you can get more information and see more things that could be influencing the maturation. But the bottom line is determining, is it a good or bad maturation, and just dealing with the nature of that planet and its need to mature. So for this person, they dealt with a lot of their weaknesses. They confronted themselves. They dealt with it healthily. They found themselves in a situation they weren't ready for. They basically got their girlfriend pregnant. And that's what their Saturn maturation was. So they'd had difficulties with their girlfriend over the years, and that's why they never married him. They loved him enough to be with them, but there was enough trouble that they never popped the question and asked him to marry him. And it had been a hard relationship. And so all of a sudden they're having a kid. She gets pregnant, and they're really put them into this whole world of him having to confront his issues and his weaknesses and how's he going to deal with the real hard things in life. And his good Saturn, he dealt with it wonderfully. He was happy to marry the girl, even though it had been hard. He was really happy to have a kid, overjoyed to have a kid. He dealt with all the burdens, extra finances, the stresses of making the wedding, because he had a good Saturn. He just went through the hard thing and was really, really happy through it all, because Saturn gave him that strength to deal with this hard thing without beating himself up. He didn't feel bad and say, oh my God, I can't believe I got this girl pregnant. I never wanted a kid with her. It wasn't like that. He was happy to have a kid with her. He saw it as, this is just the most normal thing, to have happen. He was attuned with the flow of life and nature. And and it was all a good Saturn maturation. But he still had to deal with, you know, his mistakes that created greater hardships. Was he going to deal with it by feeling bad about himself, by feeling sorry for himself? No, not with a good Saturn like this. With a bad Saturn maturation, events happen and you feel sorry for yourself for years, or you condemn yourself, or you get upset at yourself, or you hate yourself, and you can suffer for years. But he has this great Saturn maturation. As a result, he's in a really, really good space, and he's really preparing for that next maturation, which is the Rahu maturation. And he's got a good foundation going into that. Even though he came into the Saturn maturation on a very difficult Mercury maturation, where he accomplished nothing more greater. His desires to start new things were frustrated under Mercury's maturation. And all that has sort of turned around. And even amongst all the crazy things, him getting married, him having a baby, the things that he wanted to get more heavily involved with in Mercury maturation that just kind of never happened, he started being able to pull more of those things into his life. Even amongst all the other burdens, that's what the Saturn was capable of. It managed its time so much more effectively. Whereas the Mercury, being a bad Mercury maturation, it created a feeling of stress that made it harder for him to manage his life as effectively as possible. Then the Saturn maturation comes along and says, oh yeah, and here's more for you to do. You're getting married and you're having a baby. And all of a sudden he manages his time more effectively and better. Okay? So this is a story of a better, a decent, good, solid Saturn maturation. So you can see it either way, but the numbers are really, really revealing. The Lajitadi Avashtas are just such a great way to analyze the planet's ability to be productive and to help us hold our, to show us the planets that we use well, basically. And this person uses his Saturn well. Okay? I think that's it for today. Okay, next video is Rahu. Thank you.